Okay, so we have been discussing antitrust laws and their enforcement. And the subdiscipline of economics that focuses on this area is called industrial organization, or IO. And so this is a subdiscipline of microeconomics. It's interested in the structure of industries, and by that we mean is it concentrated or not. And so we've in fact already studied some models of industrial organization. For example, when we looked at oligopoly models, and we looked at game theory, and so on. This really came out of industrial organization. And it's also interesting to note that industrial organization has also spawned its own areas of study. For example, in business colleges now, there's a field of study called strategic management. And this field was founded by IO economists, and basically what they did is put antitrust rationale on its head. So for example, IO economists traditionally had been concerned with determining whether a market is, whether a firm is violating the antitrust laws, whether they're anti-competitive. But if you're a business, if you own a business, you may in fact be interested in learning how you can become a monopolist, right? Maybe how you can become a monopolist without violating the law, or maybe without getting caught. So the field of strategic management takes these models, basically, and uses them to suggest ways that you can achieve market power. That's one of the central focuses of the field of strategic management. But another area of economics, which is closely related to IO, is the economics of regulation. So in many ways, we can think about antitrust laws as being regulations, but there are some fine differences there. So for example, for one, it's a law that you can't break. But sometimes in the settlement, sometimes they'll just say, okay, you can't merge. Sometimes, like in the case of Microsoft, they'll say, okay, you can go ahead and keep operating, but you can't engage in this and this business tactic. For example, requiring computer manufacturers to put your icon on the desktop. In that case, someone's going to have to follow up on that, right? So these antitrust authorities become regulatory agencies. So there's a lot of overlap there. But one difference is, when we talk about the economics of regulation, we see that regulation applies to a wide variety of areas. Not only regulation of business firms, and this is what the field of industrial organization has been focused on, but regulation from everything from the ingredients that are listed in food products, to safety of cars and other things, to you name it. So what we see what we hear on the radio and television stations, all of these things are regulated, and so it's more than just regulation of business firms. This table 16.2 shows just a sampling of the various federal government agencies that are involved in regulation. So we see in financial markets, we have the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, Securities and Exchange Commission, and so on. Product markets, they do put the antitrust division of the Department of Justice there as a regulatory agency. We've been talking about this in the context of antitrust. But there are a bunch of other ones. The FCC regulates broadcasting and telephone industries, and also ISPs, right? Internet service providers, and so on. Federal Trade Commission, and so on. There's health and safety regulatory bodies. And of course, the EPA regulates the environment, and there are also labor regulatory agencies. And so one of the skills that is needed in firms is the ability to navigate these regulations and to make sure that you're complying at minimal cost to your firm, right? And so you should be aware of them, and then also have some sense about how they work. And the basic economic theory that we've developed till now should go some way into helping you there. We talked about in the chapter on public choice a variety of theories of government. And these apply also to theories of regulation. Because after all, regulation is just like a tax in the sense that it's a government action, right? So if we want to understand government action, we can use public choice theory. You'll recall from that discussion, before economists developed public choice theory, the prevailing notion of government action was the public interest theory. And that basically said that regulators or bureaucrats or politicians make decisions in order to maximize net benefits. So they're trying to come up with efficient solutions, and are basically benevolent social planners. But eventually, economists realized that we're not applying standards evenly when we model consumers and producers as when we model politicians and bureaucrats. So public choice theory, which is contrast to public interest theory, says that, look, politicians and bureaucrats are no better and no worse than the consumers and producers in our models. And in particular, they're self-interested. They take actions to maximize their own utility. And so this can manifest itself in many ways. As we saw with politicians, they might take actions to maximize their chance of getting elected. In the case of bureaucrats, they may take actions to maximize maybe their budget or the size of their agency, right? Maybe the quality of the furniture in their office, right? Many things which seem strange, if you're thinking about the world through the lens of public interest theory, actually make a lot of sense if you think about the world through the lens of public choice theory. Now, with respect to regulation, one popular or well-known theory is known as the capture theory of regulation. And this is a theory stating that government regulators often end up serving the regulated firms rather than their customers. And there are various mechanisms how this could come about. But one of the mechanisms is that the firms lobby the politicians and lobby the government agencies. They provide them with information. The firms provide them information that, of course, is perhaps biased in their interest. And the regulators maybe take this information at face value in order to make their job easier, or maybe there are even more nebulous reasons for it. They're getting bribed, they're getting taken out to fancy dinners, who knows? And so this theory basically holds that the regulators are captured by the very firms who they're supposed to control. And if that's the case, then regulations can hardly be thought to be consistent with the public interest, right? Public choice theory, I would say, is more general, right? So there are a lot of different ways in which regulators behave, from having good furniture or bigger budgets or more workers. And so this is just the notion that they're acting in their self-interest. But the notion that they're acting in the interests of the regulated firms is more specific. So I would say that capture theory is a part of public choice theory. It's a specific type of public choice theory. And this is important because some of the questions that you might face might ask you to identify something as either public choice theory or capture theory. And so you have to know if it's specifically about capture theory, then yes, it's public choice theory too, but a more specific answer would say it's capture theory. So we'll have a question in the next video that you'll see why I'm making this point. We already discussed that there are a wide variety of regulatory bodies, and many of them try to protect consumers, for example, from unsafe products. And there are debates about the costs and benefits of these regulations. So for example, the FDA, do you know what that one stands for? Food and Drug Administration. They have to approve new drugs before they can be sold on the market. And the benefit of this is those drugs are subjected to higher levels of testing than they might otherwise be. Now, of course, an established pharmaceutical company has a strong incentive to not sell a dangerous product, right? Because its reputation will be ruined if their product turns out to be harmful to people. And not only that, they might get sued, right? So they already have a strong incentive to not put dangerous products on the market. But this is these regulations, the FDA regulations, are designed to provide an even stronger incentive for that. And so some people say it's too much. For example, some drugs that we want to be on the market to start saving lives are held up in testing. And so meanwhile, people are dying, right? Because they can't get the drug fast enough. And so that's clearly a cost of these regulations. Now, if these regulations turn out to be effective in making sure that safer products get to market, then there could be a benefit to it. And so the extent of the regulation should be based on, to an economist at least, the cost-benefit calculus. I'll give you just one example about my own experience with two different regulatory regimes. So in the United States, if you get sick and you need medicine, you might be able to go to the store and just buy it, if it's aspirin, right? But for other types of medication, like antibiotics even, you can't do that. You have to get a doctor's prescription and then go to the pharmacy and get it, right? But in other countries, it doesn't work like that. And my wife and I had this experience one time. We were traveling from India to Hong Kong. And we both got sick in India with various different diseases. And we arrived in Hong Kong, and we were staying only for a few days. We have no idea where to go to find a doctor to get a prescription. So we asked at our hotel lobby, could you suggest a doctor for us? We need to get a prescription to get some medication. And the person behind the desk says, oh, you don't need a prescription. Just go to the pharmacy. And indeed, we went to the pharmacy around the corner. They sold us the antibiotics that we needed and the other things that we needed, and we were on our way. And so I would say that's a much better situation, right, than having to spend all day finding a doctor, getting a prescription, getting it filled. You just go to the store and buy what you need. And so, at least in that case, I would say less regulation we strongly preferred. And so this is just an example of the types of costs and benefits that we trade off when we regulate product safety, including medicine. In this last part of this section, we're talking about the trend towards deregulation that has taken place over the last few decades. And so in some ways, this is recent history, right? It's a history lesson. What happened, starting around 1978, is that a lot of industries in the United States went from being heavily regulated to being deregulated. And one example of this was the airline industry. It used to be that you had to, if you were running an airline, you had to ask the government. They had an agency that regulated the fares that could be charged on flights, and also the destinations that the airlines could serve. And so we saw that firms couldn't compete over price. And so what do you think they did? What did they do to get customers? Well, one of the things they did is offer lavish in-flight meals. And so people became accustomed to that. And once the airlines were deregulated, eventually they stopped offering meals. And nowadays, well, you didn't grow up with this, but if you want a meal on a flight, you have to pay for it, and you get usually some boxed lunch or whatever, right? But it used to be that everybody got a hot meal, even on relatively short flights. Now, you only really get that on international flights or long flights. And so this is a change. But the other thing that we saw is some small markets were no longer served. Like, for example, Fresno used to have more flights going in and out of it because the firms were required to serve those markets. But once the industry was deregulated, then the firms found it wasn't profitable and so stopped serving it as much. So, of course, some of these, for example, people who lived in Fresno might be worse off under deregulation. But on the whole, it seems that deregulation of airlines and most other industries was a really good thing. And so there's a table here that describes some of the effects of the deregulation that took place in the late 1970s. So for example, in the airline industry, fares fell about 33%. And so this is good for most people, right? In the trucking industry, the price of shipping has fallen. Also in railroads, the price has fallen. In banking, there used to be a lot of regulations concerning what they could do and what consumers could do who use the banks. Now we see, for example, there are ATMs all over the place, and banking is generally a lot easier. And so this is partly due to a change in thinking about regulation. You might say that people previously had thought about the government as acting in the public interest, but as public choice theory became more accepted, people realized maybe some of these regulations don't make sense. And so in your lifetimes, you've, for the most part, only lived in a period of deregulation. But your parents, or many other people who are alive today, have lived under both regimes, right? A more regulated regime and a less regulated regime. So this is not to say that things are going to keep going in the direction of less regulation, right? Because some things are regulated more, and sometimes things are deregulated. So there's always changes, and no one can predict the future about what's going to happen to industries. So for example, the financial industry is subject to regulations, and some people think it should be subject to more regulations, especially because they say the lack of regulations partly was due to the financial crisis that started around 2008. So there are always debates about what's the appropriate level of regulation. And again, what's the economist's answer to whether there should be more regulation? If the net benefits are positive, then yes. One final thing I'll mention is that some regulations specifically prohibit taking into account economic considerations. And so, for example, environmental regulations like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act specify certain levels of pollution, and you can't have higher levels than that. Well, it's possible that achieving that level of pollution reductions is really, really expensive. And maybe the benefits aren't that high in terms of dollars. But nonetheless, the law is written such that these considerations can't be taken into account. Well, we have a whole chapter on the environment and economic approaches to regulation in 2 lectures, so I'll save the rest of the discussion for then. The last thing I'll mention in this section is this case in point article about consumer protection laws and whether they might actually harm consumers. So take this example of safety caps. Do these prevent children from getting sick by taking their parents' medicine? Maybe, but maybe not. Why not? Well, some of the parents get frustrated with these, especially maybe grandparents who have arthritis or whatever. So instead of putting the lid back on securely, they just leave it off. And so this might actually make it easier for children to get the medicine. So in other words, this is an unintended consequence of the regulation. Another example that sometimes people claim leads to unintended consequences are requirements that you wear seatbelts. So does that save lives? Maybe, because if you get into an accident, you'll be more likely to survive it. But is there a chance that wearing your seatbelt makes you get into more accidents? Perhaps, and here's the rationale for that. Let's say you're driving down the road and you want to plug in your cell phone so you can listen to some music. But your cell phone is in the seat behind you in your backpack. If you're wearing your seatbelt, do you think you're more or less likely to reach behind you and try to fish out your cell phone than if you weren't? Well, it's possible that you'd be more likely because you think, well, worst case scenario, I get into an accident, at least I have my seatbelt on. Whereas if you don't have your seatbelt on, you may say, look, if I get into an accident, it's game over for me. So I'm not going to mess around with my cell phone right now. People who have not been exposed to the economic way of thinking are likely to find that possibility ridiculous. People will say, oh, I would never do anything to put my life in danger. But economists know that people make decisions at the margin. Right? And so you might engage in a little bit more risky behavior, because after all, it's only increasing your probability of an accident by a tiny fraction. And you do get a benefit from that cost, right? You get to listen to the music that you want to listen to. And so some have argued that requiring people to wear seatbelts makes them drive less carefully. And then, of course, for the pedestrians on the street, they're not benefited by the seatbelts at all. So if there's more pedestrian fatalities as a result of seatbelt requirements, then that's a cost of the regulation. To drive this point home, one economist made the following observation. If you really want people to drive safer, then instead of requiring them to wear seatbelts, what you should do is mount a spear in their steering wheel and have it pointed directly at their heart? Do you think you would drive more or less carefully if as you were driving there was a pointed spear right here coming out of the steering wheel? Probably more carefully, right? And so that's just the other side of the same coin, right? If you're wearing a seatbelt, then getting into an accident is less likely, and so you might drive less carefully. So just one example how the economic way of thinking can lead us to realize some of the potential unintended consequences of regulation, or in other words, the costs of regulation. And these, of course, have to be weighed against the benefits.